we are swinging it back into learning about history after taking a little break to learn some government content and skills over the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We are going to start out learning about President Washington's presidency and some growing tension that was already starting in our nation from the very beginning. Now, to kind of set the stage a little bit, the Constitution has been ratified, it has been passed, and that is the law of our land. Therefore, George Washington is going to be elected the first president of the United States. And on April 30th, 1789, George Washington takes official oath to become the first president. Like I said, there's going to be much chaos at the start of his presidency. Right away, Washington can see there was going to be many differences within Congress because of the large states, because of the small states, and also the debate of smaller and larger federal government. So on one side, members of Congress were eager to build a stronger national government, adhering a little bit to the Constitution. On the other side, members are going to be very eager to limit the power of this new government because they saw the Constitution as a threat. So here is a depiction of President Washington taking the first oath of office. It's going to be a very different look from what President Trump had in front of the Capitol building. We learned in the Geography Challenge that our first Capitol is actually in New York City, not Washington, D.C. Okay, so to begin Washington's presidency, there's actually going to be literally a debate over what to call George Washington, what the title of the president is going to be. This is actually going to start some debate within Congress here. So, because of this strong division, they are going to debate what to call the president. Supporters of a stronger national government thought the title of Your Excellency showed very deep respect. Others are going to argue that this title smelled of royalty. Remember, the president is not going to be a monarchy figure like a king or a queen. And they don't even want to even closely resemble that. Okay, finally, the debate is going to be settled, and they're going to end with calling the president Mr. President. Today, that's still kind of the term, and fortunately today we can think of possibly a president that's going to have an S on the end of that, Mrs. President. Now, one of the first major jobs of Congress was going to be creating these executive departments. Remember, underneath the executive branch, there's these departments that kind of control certain aspects of government. And there's going to be many arguments about what the department should be and what powers they should have. So to settle kind of these debates, essentially Congress settled on three essential departments. The first department they settled on is the Department of State. As you can see from this symbol to the right, what the Department of State did is it was created to handle relations with other countries, foreign policy. It's going to be very important now that since the United States is its own nation that we are talking trade with other countries, we are talking treaties with other countries, and we're making sure that we are maintaining peace at the same time. So this department is going to be led by a man you may know. Thomas Jefferson is going to be the head of the Department of State. The next department that was agreed upon was the Department of War, as you can see from this symbol to the left. The Department of War is going to be established to defend the nation. Americans knew now, but since the threat of the British, that they're going to need something in place to help defend them if something like this was ever to occur again. And this department is going to be headed by Alexander Hamilton. Another name you may have heard of, especially from the very popular play Hamilton that was in Des Moines most recently. The third department that was created was the Treasury Department. As you can see from this symbol to the right here, the Treasury Department was set up to oversee the nation's finances. We know that finance and money was kind of a major problem at the beginning of our government because we were in a lot of debt. And so this is going to be established to help kind of quell those finance issues. And this is going to be headed by a man named Henry Knox. Along with these three departments, there's also going to be someone called the Attorney General, and that position is going to be created. Really, this position was created to serve as the president's legal advisor. Think of this as a lawyer. The Attorney General is a lawyer to make sure they're answering all the president's questions that adhere to the law. And finally, the last thing that was created was a Postmaster General, which was created to head the postal system. Now, at the beginning of our nation, the Department of State, Department of War, and the Treasury Department were the three departments that were created within the executive branch. Today, we have several more departments that are within the executive branch. Here's an image of some of the departments that are currently part of the executive branch. Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Education, and so on. Okay, these departments today make up our executive branch, but when Washington was our president, there was only three departments within the executive branch. As I mentioned before, the most critical problem that was facing our new nation was the lack of funds or money that our country had. There was no money in the Treasury Department that was most recently created. There was always arguments in Congress about what and how to tax, because taxes was a very touchy subject, especially for the new Americans. In 1791, Congress agreed to place what's called an excise tax on whiskey and other luxury goods, such as carriages. Okay, so you can kind of think of this today as a tax. There is more expensive taxes on items such as alcohol and cigarettes, and there's going to be more taxes on expensive cars, and that would kind of be similar to carriages. What an excise tax is excise tax is a tax on the production or sale of a product. Now, because of this tax on whiskey and other luxury goods, there's going to be this thing known as the Whiskey Rebellion. So there were settlers that were living west of the Appalachian Mountains that reacted pretty angrily to the tax that was agreed upon by Congress. Many farmers complained that the tax made their whiskey too expensive, and they refused to pay this tax. Sound familiar? Because it was very similar to what was going on when the British government was taxing the colonists. So, therefore, these complaints turned into protests. To end the protest, Congress is going to say, okay, we're going to lower this tax. So 2 years later, in 1793, these protests actually worked, and the tax was lowered. This helped kind of quell some of the protests, but still, many farmers are just going to flat out refuse to pay. There was these guys and Americans called Whiskey Boys, and they were given that name because they were against this tax. And they actually tarred and feathered tax collectors who tried to enforce the law. Once again, sound familiar? Because it was. Tarring and feathering was something they did to the British tax collectors. Now they're doing it to the American tax collectors. So President Washington and Alexander Hamilton, the head of the War Department, saw the Whiskey Rebellion as a threat to the authority of the national government, a direct threat. Therefore, they're going to decide to lead 13,000 state militia troops across the mountains to crush these Whiskey Boys and their protests and their tarring and feathering. At the same time, Thomas Jefferson, the head of the State Department, is not going to approve of this idea because he says it was a violation of the people's liberties by using armed force. So right away, we're going to have differences in opinions between what the national government can and cannot do. Here is an image of the depiction of the Whiskey Boys tarring and feathering the tax collectors. Once again, the Whiskey Boys refused to pay the tax, and they were going to kind of punish the tax collectors for trying to get the money from them. This is a depiction of Washington leading the 13,000 state militia troops across the mountains to crush the protests and the Whiskey Boys. During this same time period, an important world event is also happening. It's called the French Revolution. And in 1789, France is going to decide to rebel against their king. They're tired of having a monarchy system. What the French vowed to do is they vowed to build a nation on liberty, equality, and fraternity, which means brotherhood. Very similar to the United States. Okay, liberty and equality being kind of major themes there. Jefferson and his followers, which were known as the Democratic Republicans, or simply known as the Republicans, were thrilled by this. They saw this as a crusade or a fight for democracy, a government for the people. But the revolution turned bloody, and 20,000 men, women, and children were killed because of the French Revolution. Alexander Hamilton and his followers, who called themselves the Federalists, were appalled by this bloodshed. Since many were wealthy, they began to feel or fear for their own safety and wonder if terrors could actually happen like this in the United States. The Whiskey Rebellion being almost similar to something that was going on in France. So they kind of feared this. So this is going to kind of highlight the main difference between the Republicans and the Federalists during this time. And here is kind of a depiction of the French Revolution. Once again, they're going to try to overthrow their king. Thomas Jefferson and his followers are really going to be thrilled by this, see it as kind of a fight for democracy, to set up a government system much like the United States. At the same time, Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, is going to see this as a threat to the United States because the followers are ganging up on the government. President George Washington's presidency is going to come to an end. And at the end of his presidency, we're going to see a growing tension between the Republicans and the Federalists. And it really disturbed Washington. And so he's going to agree to run for a second 4 years, a second term in 1792. Some are even going to argue that he was the only man that could actually keep the nation together in these dreary early years of our country. But near the end of his second term, so his second 4 years, he's going to announce that he is not going to run again. And he is going to end his presidency at 8 years. So before leaving, Washington is going to give a farewell address. Not heard by many. But he's going to remind Americans of all the things that bound them together in the first place. He wants a united country. He's also going to warn about two threats to the nation's future that he saw in his presidency that he wants to make sure the Americans are fighting to get rid of. He's saying the first thing that is a threat to our nation's future is problems with other countries. We cannot have wars. We cannot have issues with other countries. We need good foreign policy. The second thing he's going to warn against, and he's going to warn against the spirit of the party, which is essentially the dangers of passionate loyalty to parties. Political parties, that is. He's going to warn people about siding with the Democratic Republicans. He's going to warn people about siding with the Federalists. He's going to say that political parties are bad for the United States. Very ironic, because today we have a country that is heavily dependent on political parties. People literally vote for political parties, not even for the candidate sometimes. Washington says if fighting between parties is not controlled, it's going to tear the young nation apart. This is going to lead into our learning about the Federalists and the Republicans. Here's a depiction of Washington's farewell address.